Superman in Game of Thrones novel summary: the spaceship no longer landed on a farm but on a battlefield. And it wasn't the farm couple who discovered it but the King of the North. Most absurdly, this Superman wasn't from Krypton. Chapter 1: Tower of Joy. The climate in the south was vastly different from the north. Even after traveling in the south for several years, the Dornish sun still felt malicious to a native northerner. That malice was wantonly flaunted, openly and righteously filling the air around him, as if the very atmosphere itself had scorching tentacles tightly gripping Ned's heart. Ned slowly narrowed his eyes, letting the fine beads of sweat crawl across his face and spread over his entire body. He stared intently at the three knights not far in front of him. Behind the three knights was the objective of his journey, the Tower of Joy, and his sister within it. But first he needed to deal with the three knights in front of him, so the solemnity in his gray eyes grew increasingly intense, because his chances of winning were not high. The three knights clad in armor sat steadily upon their warhorses like a towering mountain blocking the path of Ned and his party of 7. The bright silver armor reflected a faint light, and the white cloaks behind them remained motionless like a long-held silence. Stark. The leading knight nodded slightly in greeting, his right hand on the reins, his left hand hidden beneath his cloak gripping his sword sheath. "I am here to guard the princess by Prince Rhaegar's command. Please turn back." His voice had a strange metallic quality. The sounds he made when his lips closed were not like words but rather like sharp blades. Ned knew this knight, or rather had heard of him for a long time, the legendary Dawnbreaker, the King's Guard, captain of the Kingsguard, the renowned undefeated knight Arthur Dane. Yet he was now an enemy Ned had to face. Lyanna is not Rhaegar's princess. She is Robert's fiancée. The worry for his sister, the guilt towards Robert, and the hatred for the royal family ignited a raging inferno in Ned or Eddard Stark's heart, burning away his fear of the Dawnbreaker. "My lord," Howland Reed placed a hand on Ned's shoulder, his worried tone and gruff voice sounding in Ned's ear. Ned understood that at this moment in this place he needed not hot-headedness but rationality. The Dawnbreaker was not a brainless bandit who could be defeated by brute force. This was a powerful knight whom even he, along with the 6 others, could not hope to defeat by fighting with all their might. He needed a clear mind to face the upcoming battle. "Lord Arthur, as a member of the Kingsguard, you must have witnessed the Mad King's atrocities firsthand. Why do you still stand in my way?" Ned took a deep breath, the scorching air rushing into his lungs just like his current mood. The Dawnbreaker fell silent for a moment. He was well aware of the king's cruelty, but as a Kingsguard he had sworn an oath of lifelong loyalty to the king, to become the most solid shield and the sharpest sword in the king's hand. No matter whom the blade was pointed at, he should not show an ounce of hesitation or sympathy. "Lord Stark, you should understand what a knight must do in this situation." Ned tightened his grip on the reins, drew his blade, and with a determined gaze at Arthur and the 2 others he let out a low cry. The party of 7, led by Ned, spurred their warhorses forward, charging. Arthur and the 2 others moved in unison, skillfully leaning forward, drawing their swords and charging their horses all in one fluid motion. The 2 sides were less than 3 zhang apart, and before the 10 warhorses could reach their top speed they clashed in close combat. Ned swung his sword, flashing a bright light under the scorching sun, aiming straight for Arthur's throat, but it was easily parried. Arthur then drew another longsword and thrust it directly at Ned. Ned's pupils constricted, his gray eyes seemingly stained bright silver by the blade. Seeing the danger, Howland, who was beside him, didn't have time to block the sword in front of him. He put all his strength into his hands and stabbed his sword into the neck of Arthur's warhorse. The horse reared up and neighed, causing Arthur's fatal strike to miss, saving Ned's life. Howland, however, took a sword strike, cried out in pain, and fell from his horse. Luckily he avoided being trampled by the warhorse and lay on the ground, unable to get up for a moment. In an instant the 2 sides passed each other. 4 of Ned's knights, however, lay dead by the sword. Their riderless warhorses, startled, galloped towards the Tower of Joy not far away. The 4 knights lay on the dry, hard earth, their crimson blood flowing out, mixing with the soil, creating a muddy mess. Martin Castle, Willem Dustin, Ethan Glover, Mark Riswell, Howland Reed. Ned didn't have time to grieve. He merely recited the names of the 5 fallen knights in his heart before turning his attention to Arthur and the others who had passed by. Even though Arthur and the 2 others were Kingsguard, skilled in both swordsmanship and horsemanship, Ned's party consisted of equally first-rate knights. With 2 fists unable to contend with 4 hands, Oswell went. One of the 3 also became a casualty of the sword, and Gerald Heitwer, known as the White Bull, only sustained a sword wound to his left shoulder. His warhorse was unharmed and he still had the strength to fight. In contrast, the Dawnbreaker, Arthur, though uninjured due to Howland's desperate efforts, lost his warhorse. He rolled on the ground, then rose to grab the reins of Oswell's warhorse. Ned and the other man seized the opportunity, not allowing Arthur to remount, and charged forward in haste. The White Bull, Gerald, spurred his horse towards Ned, while Lou charged directly at Arthur. Ned leaned forward, his longsword not aimed at Gerald but instead plunged into Gerald's warhorse. Gerald, with a similar intuition, made the same choice. However, with his left shoulder injured, his strength was insufficient, and his speed was 3 points slower than Ned's. The moment he fell from his horse, Ned's sword pierced his throat. Amidst the warhorse's sorrowful neighs, he died with a gurgling sound. After dispatching his opponent, Ned dismounted from his slowly collapsing warhorse and turned to look at the other battle. A scene filled with anger and a chill in his mind met his eyes. Arthur, seeing Lou charging on horseback, remained calm. He judged that a forced remount meant death, while turning to fight meant survival. Allowing Lou's longsword to strike, he ducked to the side, dodging the sword, then held his swords with both hands and arched his back. A spurt of blood shot into the air, and the knight who had passed by was decapitated. Arthur, propping himself up with his sword, stared at Ned's face, which showed either fear or hatred, then grimly raised his sword and charged. Clang! Ned swung his sword to meet the attack. The moment their weapons clashed, his entire body shuddered. Ned felt an unstoppable force assault him, his legs weakened, and he almost collapsed to the ground under the pressure. Gritting his teeth, he instinctively half-knelt, his back to the Tower of Joy, trembling as he held his longsword defensively over his shoulder. He stared intently into Arthur's placid brown eyes, which seemed to reflect his own flushed, gritting yet powerless and awaiting death face. Suddenly, a whistling sound came, violent and urgent, accompanied by a rumbling like distant thunder, drawing closer and closer. Ned saw a flash of fire in Arthur's clear eyes, a fire that almost filled his pupils. Those previously calm pupils were now filled with fire, as if two suns had appeared in the sky and one of them was growing larger and larger. Arthur's cold composure could no longer be maintained. In a flash, Ned didn't have time to think much. The force from Arthur on his parrying sword gradually weakened. He knew this was his only chance to turn defeat into victory, to snatch life from death. Just as he was about to forcefully press his sword back, he saw a sword tip emerge from Arthur's throat, spraying blood onto Ned's face and dyeing his vision red. Arthur, struck by this fatal blow, felt all strength drained from his body. His longsword slipped from his grasp and he fell to the ground, yet his eyes remained fixed on Ned's back. The fire in his unseeing, dissipating pupils grew more intense. The relief of escaping death, which had just filled his heart, hadn't even reached his face when Howland, who had turned the tide of the battle, screamed in terror, "My lord!" Ned swore he couldn't imagine a gruff man like Howland emitting such a high-pitched, piercing shriek as if it would rupture his eardrums. As thoughts flickered, poor Ned, before he could even process his complex emotions, was suddenly pressed down by Howland, who had thrown himself on top of him. In a daze, Howland's pupils, like the deceased Arthur's, were also filled with fire. Those fire-filled pupils now pierced Ned's heart like sharp blades, making him suddenly feel uneasy and terrified. It was an intuitive sensation, one that was more intense than even the moment he faced Arthur when he was extremely close to death. He wanted to know what had happened, so he struggled to look past Howland's firm but trembling chest, towards the rear. Then he saw a scene he would never forget, a scene so impactful he couldn't even begin to comprehend what it meant to him. He could only let out a mournful cry as if it took all his strength, a wail like that of a stray dog who had lost everything. No, boom tilde tilde, in an instant, everything was engulfed in this earth-shattering roar with nothing else remaining. The desperate wails of humans and the mournful cries of the surviving warhorses blended into it, leaving only the roar. The several tall human-made structure of earth and stone, the Tower of Joy, offered no resistance to this descending blaze, let alone the bedridden humans and newborn infants within. Everything in the Tower of Joy vanished inch by inch with the roaring sound. Crushed earth and stone shot out like powerful crossbow bolts in the roaring blast. Ned felt Howland's constantly trembling body tense up amidst the roar, then gradually soften with thump-thump sounds, and after an unknown period become stiff. All he could do was not disappoint Howland, burying himself deep beneath this human shield, sobbing and wailing, yet bravely and strongly living on through the pain. If all of this is punishment, old gods, please tell me why you still let me live. After everything calmed down, Ned knelt in a daze amidst the ruins. Lucky or unlucky, he had only been hit on his right leg by a piece of rubble and had a shallow sword wound on his left shoulder left by Arthur. And before him, the sole reason he was alive, Howland. This man who had saved him twice in a short time. No, how many times? Ned looked at the shattered Howland before him, making it impossible to imagine what terrible things he had endured. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Supreme Ruler of the North, Warden of the North. What meaning does that hold in this disaster? The objective of this journey, Lyanna in the Tower of Joy. Howland's tragic state entered Ned's vision. Lyanna must have also been completely destroyed along with the Tower of Joy. If I hadn't arrived today, even if Lyanna died, Howland and the others wouldn't have died so meaninglessly, would they? Ned thought. He didn't know how long he had knelt, more like a statue than a living person. It wasn't until the sunlight faded and the dust settled that he seemed to revive like a deceased person of many years. He wandered lifelessly through the ruins. He had to collect the remains, for both friend and foe should have a resting place after death. Chapter 2. Rebirth. Amidst the ruins, Huan Chang finished the session of cultivation and tried to open his eyes. He found that he still couldn't manage this simple action. He hadn't been able to open his eyes for a long time, so long that he was almost forgetting how long it had been, from the initial panic and fear, to the struggle where he couldn't even make his eyelids twitch, and now to numbness. He had grown accustomed to the feeling of his body being under his control, yet even the slightest movement was an extravagant hope. After every cultivation session, attempting to open his eyes was his act of defiance against fate. This attempt, as usual, failed again. He began to recall the past. Starting from the earliest memory he could trace, he meticulously reviewed every detail in his mind. He didn't know how many times these memories had played out in his mind. It started after he finished a cultivation session and thought of his daughter, startling him to realize that her image and laughter had become blurry. Only then did he make the decision to recall his past after every cultivation session. His past, through countless recollections, had long been broken apart and kneaded into his mind, while every detail about his daughter was cherished and deeply buried in the deepest recesses of his mind. He could forget his unpleasant childhood, forget the hardship of struggling alone, forget her who suddenly burst into his life and then departed, forget everything. The only two things he desperately wanted to remember were himself and his daughter. If he were to forget his daughter, he didn't know what would happen to him. His strenuous efforts to wake up were partly due to basic human instinct, and partly because he knew his daughter was still waiting for him. Whenever he thought of this, he would seriously ponder if he had been wrong. Should he not have rushed into an experiment that looked suicidal to outsiders and even to himself? Wouldn't it have been fine to just spend his whole life with his daughter? Then he would arrive at the exact same answer after every reflection. He himself didn't know why. He couldn't figure out the reason that made him crazy enough to gamble everything on the strange experiment that had left him unable to wake up until this day. Since Chang had memory, he had lived in an orphanage. The director was a middle-aged man who loved Taoist culture and was obsessed with unrealistic cultivation and refining the Tao. He would occasionally recite Taoist scriptures to the orphans, and Chang was deeply influenced by him. After he grew up and completed his compulsory education, he stopped believing in the qi refinement and breathing exercises the director often mumbled about. When the director passed away, and Chang attended the funeral and was so sad that he momentarily deceived himself into believing the director had achieved transcendence and ascended. Thinking about it now, perhaps the cultivation was real and the director's ascension was just self-comfort, and Chang inwardly scoffed at himself. His experiment should be considered a success. It verified that humans could indeed cultivate qi. However, whether controlling this qi as it roamed through his body counted as cultivation, and Chang wasn't too clear and no one could answer him. He was probably the only one on the entire planet who had cultivated qi. He believed it was cultivation and no one could refute him. If he could wake up, he might even become the progenitor of qi cultivation. But how long had it been since he cultivated this qi in the experiment, from wisps and threads to an ocean-like sea? He had been maintaining this state of conscious awareness, with his body under control but utterly immobile. It had been so long that despair had taken root in his heart. He feared suddenly waking up to find himself too old to move, and that his daughter, whom he had forcefully pulled into his experiment as an assistant from a third-rate university, was now involved in an old cow-eating young grass scenario. He might even have children calling him grandpa. The thought made Chang's scalp tingle, and he dared not think further. And Chang exhaled inwardly, suppressed the chaotic thoughts in his mind, buried the memories deep, and began cultivating again. Hoo-ha! Another cultivation session ended, and Chang slowly guided the qi back to his energy center and sighed inwardly, trying to open his eyes. The result was the same as countless times before, failure however, and Chang seemed to hear a faint, strange sound. Mixed among the sounds of his own heartbeat, blood flow, and the qi churning in his energy center, there was a very, very faint yet unusually firm light chime. Like the beep sound made when an access control system opens, and Chang suddenly became agitated. To Chang, this light chime was like a sudden clap of thunder in absolute silence, deafening, no, much more intense. He focused all his attention on this light chime. It was like the ecstatic feeling of a previously deaf person hearing sound for the first time. It made him wonder if he had finally gone mad after long darkness. He confirmed it several times. The light chime was crisp and piercing, resounding firmly by his ear. After a few chimes, the light chime abruptly stopped, followed by a mechanical synthesized voice. This voice seemed to be stating something, yet Chang was absolutely certain that unless he had truly gone insane, he should be able to understand what it meant. In reality, Chang couldn't understand it. The sound had an orderly cadence. Apart from lacking any emotion, it was clearly a language, but it was not any language Chang knew. His excitement was shattered by this speech. The unfamiliar language and mechanical tone plunged Chang into deep unease. After the mechanical sound, there was no further sound, but Chang waited anxiously. After an unknown amount of time, he felt a sensation in his body like surging water, gently and softly gathering in his chest. Then Chang opened his eyes. A pair of clean, clear, large eyes slowly shed a tear, which traced a path down his tender, fair cheek, landing in the solidified dust and stirring up ugly splashes of mud. What met his sight was not the bright white light he longed for, nor the hospital ceiling he had anticipated, nor even the various terrible scenarios his overactive imagination conjured after hearing the strange language. It was perhaps worse than all of those. It was a blood-stained longsword. The blood had dried on the blade, presenting a dark black gleam under the dim sunset, and Chang could smell a faint, fishy odor. The sword was suspended right before his eyes, and he could clearly see the tip still trembling. Worse than this scene upon opening his eyes was everything this scene implied. The moment he regained sensation, and Chang realized he had turned into an infant. He had no idea what bizarre event had caused him, a 34-year-old man, to transform from endless dark torment into an infant lying in this strange place. He only felt terror and despair. What terrified and despaired him wasn't the trembling, blood-stained longsword hovering before him. He didn't even know what he was terrified or despairing about. He just involuntarily shed tears of regret. The joy that should have accompanied rebirth was now mixed with despair and regret, transforming into an unknown emotion. Ned simply bandaged the wound on his right leg, then silently cleared the ruins before him. He moved the shattered stone pieces one by one. If a piece was slightly larger, he pried it open with a piece of wood he picked up. If he encountered a wooden beam blocking the rubble, he fiercely chopped it into several sections with his longsword. Only when the heat slightly subsided, the sun dipped low in the west, did he neatly arrange the bodies of the 6 knights who had accompanied him. Then he cleared toward the center of the ruins and found the body of Lyanna, which was still vaguely recognizable, and the infant in her arms, whose face was blue and who had long stopped breathing. He couldn't help but break down into loud sobs again. As his crying subsided, Ned inadvertently spotted a black, circular object not far away. Under the setting sun, the dark purple patterns on the black circular object emitted an ominous glow. Ned, holding his longsword, walked toward it. Right before Ned's eyes, the dark purple patterns on the black circular object began to twist and deform. The circle slowly shrank bit by bit. The circular body, which was originally about 2 meters in diameter, had shrunk to about 1 meter by the time Ned approached. Even after experiencing all the terrifying things that day, the scene before him, which challenged the common sense of his life, still filled him with incredulity. It also put him on high alert, and he slowly held his sword horizontally in front of him. He approached cautiously. The circular body began to sink and deform. By the time Ned reached it, it had transformed into the shape of an infant. Then the black and purple color slowly slid away, revealing tender hands and feet. Like flowing water, the black and purple slowly converged on the infant's chest, forming a black and purple mark. In an instant, Ned's not-so-rich reasoning ability seemed divinely inspired as he reached a conclusion. The culprit behind this disaster was the seemingly harmless infant before him. With this thought, the longsword he held horizontally struck toward the infant's brow with hatred. Just at that moment, the infant opened its eyes. Ned looked at the infant before him. Sparse black hair, clear black eyes, faint eyebrows, and the tear tracing across its eyelid. The longsword in his hand began to tremble. Ah! He shouted as if to muster courage, but ultimately dropped the longsword aside and knelt before the infant. Picking the child up, he said, "Perhaps you are the murderer in all this, but the result was brought about by my own fault." With that, a new tear streak appeared on his face. The knightly education he received prevented him from harming an innocent infant, and thus he attributed the sin of the disaster that ensued to himself. Even if it was wishful thinking on his part, since things had come to this, he had no other choice but to bear the weight of it all. The sun set, casting red light upon the ruins, falling upon Ned and the infant as if staining them with a layer of blood. Their shadows stretched longer and longer until they disappeared into the darkness. Chapter 3. A wonderful change. Beep tilde. Thought fluctuations detected. Starting scanning program. Beep tilde. Genetic testing complete. Meets Nuoga civilization main body standards. Beep tilde. Abnormal thought fluctuations. Excessive activity detected. Initiating emergency protocol. Protocol initiation failed. Reporting to main program. Beep tilde. Main program connection lost. Initiating default command. Beep tilde. Insufficient energy. This program is dormant. Following the civilization main body's final command. Initiating emergency procedures. Emergency armor installation complete. Main program dormancy complete. Awakening expected after 3 Nuoga star revolutions. Beep tilde tilde. It took Chang quite some time to bury all his emotions deep in his heart. By the time he was in the mood to consider his own situation, he found himself wrapped in swaddling clothes and tied to a man's chest. The person who tied him probably hadn't considered that he was still an infant, as he was bound both tightly and awkwardly. With his limbs splayed out, what made him uncomfortable was that he was facing the man's chest. From the corner of his eye, he could see the dim scenery continuously rising and falling as it receded. From this, he deduced that the man was riding a horse and had begun his journey in a hurry at sunrise. At this moment, he could do nothing, or so he thought, because right now he was an infant. Suddenly, a beep similar to an access control system opening sounded in his ear, followed by incomprehensible mechanical words. And Chang was a bit curious. He felt certain that it was only after this sound occurred that he had woken from that strange state and turned into an infant. He roughly guessed that all these changes were caused by this sound. So when the sound rang out again, hope rose in his heart. But soon the meaningless sounds faded away and he found to his disappointment that nothing had happened. Time passed quietly during the bumpy journey, and Chang began his cultivation. Strictly speaking, this was the first time he had cultivated while conscious. Just as he mobilized, the chi gathered at his energy center. This vast, ocean-like chi, like a husky breaking free from its leash, impatiently and frantically surged from the energy center toward every part of his body. This chi passed through fascia, crossed tendons, washed over bones, and bored into the deepest parts of the marrow. Going even deeper, it permeated cell walls, passed through ground substance, and headed straight for the most distant reaches. In an instant, the chi that Chang had spent an unknown amount of time cultivating vanished without a trace, not a single shred remaining. Amidst his shock, a tremor from the deepest part of his soul caused him to lose consciousness instantly. At the same time he lost consciousness, wisps of chi emerged from the deepest parts of his cells, spreading out into an invisible field that followed the shape of his body. This field clung just a millimeter above Chang's surface, yet remained connected to the innermost depths of his physique. Then the field suddenly retracted to the deepest part of his body, and just as suddenly surged out again. Round and round it went, repeating a verifiable 3.3 billion times in a single millisecond. From then on, this cycle of retraction and surging never ceased. The dark purple patterns on Chang's chest unwillingly peeled away bit by bit within the field cycle, finally turning into a dark purple necklace hanging from his chest. Within the cycle of the field, a type of energy, extremely thin yet omnipresent in this land, seemed to be drawn in, slowly joining the cycle along with sunlight and heat. Ned rode his warhorse, galloping through the wilderness. Fortunately, the warhorse Ned was riding had originally belonged to the Kingsguard Oswell. During yesterday's battle, it had bolted in fright and avoided the aftermath of the conflict. Afterward, the horse returned to find its master and was taken by Ned. As he galloped, the sun rose slowly, radiating fierce malice toward the Northmen. Heat surged and the air was scorched into distorted shapes. The resilience of Northmen was tempered in bitter cold. They were truly ill-equipped to face the vicious sun of the Dorne border. Thus, Ned was soaked as if he'd been fished out of water, having taken a rather dirty bath in his own sweat. His horse was also panting incessantly. If it hadn't been for the 7 of them not hiding their tracks while searching for Lyanna, their movements being almost entirely exposed to both friend and foe, perhaps Ned wouldn't have been traveling so relentlessly. Originally, the 7 had traveled light to catch the Royalists off guard. But not only had they returned empty-handed, only Ned and a heaven-sent infant survived. Having delayed for another day, no matter how slow the Royalists were to react, they wouldn't just watch one of the enemy leaders, Ned, return safely to his base. The pursuing knights were surely on their way by now, which was why Ned dared not stop. At the first light of dawn, he had mounted his horse and headed north. As the sun climbed higher, Ned had to admit that the heat of the south and the cold of the north were entirely different trials. Especially with the sweat soaking the wound on his right leg, the pain was becoming unbearable. Suddenly the heat seemed to recede. Ned felt a coolness emanate from his chest, gradually spreading through his whole body, causing him to let out a long, involuntary sigh. Looking down at the infant in his arms, the child seemed to be asleep. His shallow breathing was impossible to catch without listening closely. Ned's feelings were complicated. The infant in his arms falling from the sky was already beyond normal imagination, and the current peculiarities only made it clearer that this was no ordinary human child. Ned pulled the reins and stopped. Galloping relentlessly from sunrise until the sun was high, the horse was nearly at its limit. If he didn't stop now, Ned would have to finish the journey on foot. After dismounting, he took out the fodder and water he'd packed yesterday to feed the horse and grabbed a few quick bites for himself. Benefiting from the coolness in his arms, he was about to sit down and rest for a moment. A faint muffled sound of hooves flickering in and out of hearing caused Ned's expression to change drastically. He gritted his teeth and tightened the bandage on his right leg wound. The cloth's original color was no longer visible, stained a dark red by blood. He vaulted onto the horse, driving the reluctant animal into a gallop. After half a day of hard riding, he had left the Dorne border and entered the Stormlands, which should have been under Robert's control. However, ever since Lyanna was abducted and his father and brother were brutally killed in King's Landing, and his foster father Jon Arryn raised the banner of rebellion against the Mad King, the entire continent had been filled with undercurrents. Outside the north, there were few he could trust besides his foster father and Robert. Moreover, his foster father and Robert should be leading their armies toward King's Landing by now. There was no way reinforcements could come to his aid. Those dense hoofbeats must be pursuers circling around from the reach. Most likely it was a cavalry unit from Rhaegar's guard. Hearing the hoofbeats meant the cavalry was already extremely close. Logically, he should have spotted them earlier on his journey, but he hadn't. As he galloped, the hoofbeats grew closer. Ned pulled his reins with a grim face because the sound was coming from ahead, not behind. He could already see the dragon banners fluttering in the wind. A disciplined troop of cavalry appeared. Ned had no intention of surrendering without a fight, but he and his horse were exhausted. Even if he managed to turn around and gamble that there were no pursuers coming from Dorne, he wouldn't get far. Surrender seemed to be his only choice at this moment. Considering Robert's army was approaching King's Landing, Ned would likely be captured to be used as a hostage to force Jon Arryn, Robert, and the others to surrender. But that wasn't the case. The cavalry company of 100, seeing Ned standing still on his horse from afar, didn't slow down. Instead, with a shout, they broke formation and accelerated into a semicircular charge. The hoofbeats suddenly quickened. The charge of 100 cavalrymen exuded an unstoppable momentum, especially since their target was just one man and one horse. It seemed that in the next second Ned would be swept away and torn to pieces by this torrent of riders. There was no communication, nor was any needed. The order this cavalry had received was to kill everyone they saw on their path. Whether it was a lowly commoner or a noble lord, everyone encountered on this mission was to be put to the sword. The warhorse snorted uneasily. Before the momentum of the knight's charge could overwhelm Ned, it had already nearly driven the beast into a panic. Ned struggled with all his might to control the horse, his mind racing to find a way to survive this death trap. Currently, he was within the Stormlands, near the border of Dorne. Perhaps due to the climate, aside from some slightly rolling terrain, the area was an open wilderness as far as the eye could see. Even a proper grove of trees was hard to find, which was why the 100 knights could form a charge. It seemed like a certain death trap for him. Fortunately, they were over 50 meters apart. If they hadn't been in the open wilderness, they wouldn't have spotted each other at all. To Ned's left, there was a sparse grove of trees. He had no intention of giving up. The moment the cavalry charged, he made the wisest choice. He turned sharply left and bolted toward the grove. Though it might be a deathbed struggle and he might very well be swept away by the torrent before reaching the trees, it was the best survival move he could make. Amidst swirling dust and flying hooves, Ned pulled out a short dagger and stabbed it into the warhorse's rump. The horse shrieked in pain and galloped forward with all its might. By the narrowest of margins, he darted into the woods before the charging cavalry could reach him. The charging cavalry shifted direction with Ned, finally slowing down reluctantly before the woods and halting their momentum. However, they only paused briefly before the 100 riders split into 20 small squads and also plunged into the forest, startling flocks of birds into flight. The woods were not dense. In fact, they were quite sparse. They were enough to stop a charge of 100 knights, but clearly not enough to escape their pursuit. Unless the old gods manifested today, Eddard Stark was surely a dead man. Chapter 4, Death Has Arrived. After entering the woods, Ned found a slightly denser area and was about to leap off his horse. However, he saw the warhorse's 4 hooves go soft, foaming at the mouth as its head plunged toward the ground. He had no choice but to roll onto the ground. Getting up, he looked at the warhorse, which still had a breath of life left, and sighed inwardly. In this desperate situation, he couldn't help but feel fortunate that the infant tied to his chest had not cried from beginning to end, remaining in a peaceful slumber throughout. He wondered if in this certain death scenario he should abandon the infant somewhere in the woods. Even if he died, if the child was lucky enough to be discovered by the pursuers, they might survive. Otherwise, in the foreseeable battle, the infant would almost certainly die. Thinking this, he carefully untied the cloth strips around his chest, intending to hold the child. To his amusement, he found the child's hands and feet tightly gripping the edges of his light armor, clinging to him like an octopus. A faint smile appeared on his long face, which usually looked as if it held a deep-seated grudge. He tied the cloth strips back and stroked the back of the infant's head. Then his gray eyes scanned the surroundings. Crouching low and enduring the sharp pain from his right leg, he climbed a large tree. If this child hadn't fallen from the sky, he might have died under Arthur's sword. Similarly, if Howland hadn't pinned him down, he would have died in those ruins. Being buried in those ruins along with his comrades, enemies, and family might have been his best end. But this wasn't bad either. At least the culprit who caused the deaths of Howland, his sister, and his nephew would die with him. That way, when he met his sister and the others in the world of the dead, he wouldn't be met with resentment, if a world of the dead even existed. Ned's thoughts gradually drifted away until the sound of hoofbeats startled him awake. A squad of 5 cavalrymen appeared in his line of sight. At the same moment Ned saw the 5 men, they also spotted Ned clinging to the large tree. The round-faced knight at the lead couldn't help but let out a sneer, and the other 4 also burst into laughter. They slowly stopped beneath the tree, looking up and staring mockingly at Ned. The round-faced knight took out a whistle and blew 2 sharp blasts. The shrill sound echoed through the small woods. Before long, the sound of many hoofbeats approached, and over 100 cavalrymen soon surrounded the tree in multiple layers. Ned quietly watched the crowd of cavalrymen gradually surrounding him. He saw a dragon banner that couldn't unfurl properly in the woods and a knight who emerged from the crowd, whom he guessed was the leader of this troop. This leading knight scrutinized Ned for a moment with his red eyes, then he spoke. "Lord Stark?" Though it was a question, his tone was certain. In Ned's estimation, if he were lucky, hiding in a tree 7 or 8 meters high, a moment of negligence from the knights might have allowed him to be overlooked and escape. But the old gods clearly did not favor him. Thinking about it, the trees were sparse and this wasn't some dense forest with thick foliage. Only a blind man would fail to see such a large person. It wasn't that Ned had lost his mind, it was a desperate move. Other than doing this and gambling on luck, what else could he have done? Hearing the leading knight's question, Ned's lips twitched. Just as he was about to speak, he saw the leading knight wave his hand dismissively and coldly order, "Horse archers, prepare." Following the command, 20 riders drew their bows and notched arrows from their horses, aiming at Ned in the tree. Ned's pupils constricted instantly and his whole body tensed. Rushing to speak before the leading knight ordered them to fire, he said urgently, "I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Sir Knight, I request an honorable death." Only then did Ned realize his voice had become very strange, hoarse, and strained. Hearing this, the leading knight smiled, his expression full of contempt. "I know Lord Stark. I also know the words of House Stark. Winter is coming." The leading knight drawled the latter half with mock solemnity, then his face turned stern. "Wonder what kind of honorable death my lord desires. What kind of honorable death does a rebel deserve? Ha ha ha." The first half seemed like a serious answer to Ned, but for the second half he scanned the surrounding knights and finally couldn't help but laugh out loud. The chill at his chest had not dissipated, spreading throughout Ned's body. However, the leading knight's rhetorical question still made Ned's face burn. He realized that by speaking, he was only inviting humiliation. It would have been better to wait for death in peace. Opening his mouth had only caused him to suffer an insult for nothing. The leading knight suppressed his laughter and said, "My lord, winter will only come after you die, and for you, death has." Voice was excited as he delivered the final judgment to Eddard. Fire. The 20 horse archers released their bowstrings. 20 sharp arrows burst from the strings, flashing with light. Suddenly, everything seemed to freeze. The dappled sunlight, the raised hooves, the contemptuous sneers, the arrows passing through the leaves, the gray eyes about to close. Beep. Damage to the civilization main body detected. Inquiring whether to initiate emergency armor coverage fusion. Response from the civilization main body. Inquiring again. No response from the civilization main body. Transferring to main program for processing. Beep. Main program is dormant. According to the supreme directive of the Nuoga civilization, the civilization main body is above all else, making the following judgment. Immediately destroy all low-level life on this planet. Commencing feasibility check. Beep. Energy insufficient. This plan cannot be implemented. Attempt to awaken the civilization main body and perform emergency armor coverage fusion. Commencing feasibility check. Beep. Commencing implementation. Beep. Awakening attempts have reached the limit, still unable to establish contact with the civilization main body's consciousness. This plan implementation failed. 3. This plan cannot be implemented. 465. Violating Nuoga Civilization Directive Number 746,503,201. Subcolony rigs may not be split without the consent of the civilization main body. Splitting emergency subcolony rig to perform coverage fusion on the low-level organism in physical contact with the civilization main body. Commencing feasibility check. Beep. Commencing implementation. Implementation complete. Estimated success rate is 99.9%. The Nuoga civilization spark armor, forced to become a necklace hanging on Chang's chest, flickered with a dark purple light. It split off a sliver invisible to the naked eye, which suddenly plunged into Ned's body. Everything seemed to return to normal. Ned did his best to curl his body, protecting the infant in his arms. In the blink of an eye, 20 arrows drew shallow arcs, making whistling sounds as they landed on Ned's body. A few arrows were obstructed by branches and lost their aim, thudding into the tree trunk beside Ned. But most pierced deeply through his light armor and easily entered his body. The most fatal was an arrow that entered from the back of his neck and passed through his throat, mirroring Arthur's death. The child in my arms shouldn't have been hit, right? But even if he wasn't, what difference does it make? Is this my last thought before death? This thought flashed through Ned's mind as his consciousness began to sink into boundless darkness, just like his body falling helplessly toward the ground. The leading knight had a smile on his face, his red eyes reflecting Ned's falling corpse. He narrowed his eyes. There seemed to be a bright light trying to pierce his retina. Boom, crackle. Chapter 5. Not today. Summer in the south was hot and stifling. To northerners, everything south of the north was considered the south. Dorne, located at the southernmost tip of the continent and bordering the Stormlands, was near the sea, so southerly winds often blew in from across the ocean to slightly dispel the dry heat. Lately, there had been no sea breeze for a long time, making the air increasingly heavy and distorted, twisting into wave-like arcs under the teasing heat. Suddenly, a massive suction force emanated from the woods. The air current surged joyfully toward the source of the attraction, creating a gale out of thin air. Leaves rustled loudly as the gale rose abruptly, sweeping up clouds of dust. Yet the dry heat in the air did not dissipate in the slightest. Instead, it grew more intense. The heat finally reached its limit and a flash of light burst forth. As soon as the light appeared, it expanded and spread, followed by a sound like muffled thunder. Boom! The light reflected in the leading knight's red eyes and spread throughout the entire forest. For a moment, it seemed as if only this white light remained in the world. Over 100 cavalrymen were blinded by the white light. Before they could even close their eyelids, while the muffled thunder still echoed in their ears, the sound of trees snapping and cracking reached them. A massive figure slammed into the ground, crushing several trees and flattening a dozen unfortunate knights. emitting the dull thud of a heavy object hitting the earth. In a daze, the leading knight heard a buzzing, tragic howl in his ears, accompanied by the pained shrieks of war horses. Only then did he snap back to his senses and vigorously rub his incessantly tearing eyes. What happened, and during the pain, he finally saw the scene before him through a blur. A knight with only half his body visible was wailing and spitting blood. His hands were clawing outward frantically and futilely, trying to struggle free from under the heavy object. Beside him was a struggling horse's head, shrieking in pain as pools of blood sprayed from its mouth. This absurd scene, seen through double vision, made the leading knight widen his eyes in disbelief. Ignoring the stinging pain in his eyes, he strained to tilt his head back, trying to see exactly what it was that was crushing the knights and horses. It looked like a human arm magnified several times. Even lying flat, it was nearly 2 meters high. The flesh-colored skin was covered in dark purple patterns pinning down the knight's lower body. The leading knight groaned unconsciously, staring at the scene in shock. The massive object moved. The arm lifted slowly, applying force. With a simple motion of sitting up, it knocked down several more trees. As the upper body sat up, broken branches hung from its shoulders. The back, covered in dark purple patterns, was stained with patches of crimson blood, and messy hair covered the back of its giant head. The upper body alone, just sitting up, stood before him like a small castle. The giant head, with its back to the knight, slowly turned. Half a face hidden in shadow was revealed, covered in dark purple patterns. Gray eyeballs the size of a normal person's head stared intently at the knights in the forest. The massive thing crushing the dozen knights was actually a castle-sized giant. The knights, lucky enough not to be crushed beneath the giant, collapsed, trembling all over. They turned their horses and fled. A few seemed so overwhelmed by terror that instead of fleeing away from the giant, they charged straight toward it. The giant didn't even move. The few knights who charged into it crashed against its body, falling from their horses in a heap. They lay on the ground, spitting blood and moaning in semi-conscious agony. Seeing the knights fleeing for their lives, the giant finally seemed to react. It turned its body and stood up from the ground, the sound of trees snapping and breaking echoing continuously. As the giant stood up, its full form was finally revealed: messy mid-length black hair, a long face, and narrow gray eyes. Its entire body was covered in dark purple patterns. Trees in the forest that were 8 or 9 meters tall barely reached its waist. The giant looked down at the scattering knights and tried to step out to pursue them, but it felt like it stepped into thin air. Its body fell forward, slamming straight into the forest and kicking up clouds of dust. The giant rose slowly again, like a toddler learning to walk. It carefully took a step forward, making a loud thump. That single step covered 7 or 8 meters, but as it took the second step, its posture became unstable and its massive body swayed. The giant simply stopped. Its gaze fell upon the surrounding trees and it tentatively uprooted a large tree. Its giant gray eyes seemed to light up. The giant raised the tree, aimed at a fleeing knight, and hurled it with force. With a crash, a cloud of dust rose in the distance. Clear, tragic wails reached the giant's ears, and the corners of its massive mouth twitched. Tree after tree was smashed or hurled by the giant at the scattered knights until no moving figures remained in sight. The forest was almost completely destroyed before the giant stopped, standing in the middle of the wreckage in silence. After a long time, the giant raised its hands, its gaze lingering on the rough hands covered in dark purple patterns, seemingly deep in thought. Then those giant eyeballs shifted slightly, carefully inspecting its own massive physique. In the sunlight, the stationary giant cast a massive humanoid shadow behind it. As if remembering something, the giant touched its chest. Other than the rough sensation, there was nothing else. "Ha!" the giant exhaled, sounding like both a sigh and a breath of relief. It then scanned the surroundings, looked at the midday sun, turned its back to the light, and began walking northward with steady, heavy steps that were slow yet covered ground rapidly. Dull thuds of footsteps echoed across the wilderness. The footsteps went from sounding once every few seconds to once every second, eventually becoming like continuous muffled thunder spreading through the dry air. The giant began to run. Its posture was strange, moving the same arm and leg at the same time, but it slowly normalized after a while. Of course, on this continent, a castle-sized giant was inherently abnormal. Looking down from a bird's-eye view, the giant's initial movements were much like a human child learning to walk, gradually becoming more proficient and eventually running. Occasionally, it let out an unintelligible roar, the tone of which was no different from the joyful shouts of a child running through a field on a spring outing. Strictly speaking, Ned had died when he lost consciousness, even if only for a fraction of a millisecond. But for Ned, it had been an unknown duration of darkness until a light appeared, awakening his consciousness from silence. He had thought he had been sinking in darkness for an eternity, though in reality it was only an instant, until he sat up by reflex and the knights, who looked like crawling insects, entered his vision. He still hadn't figured out what had happened. The flight of the knights finally allowed him to recall everything that happened before he lost consciousness. Following his body's instincts to crush the knights with trees, he finally had time to think about all of this. He, Eddard Stark, had turned into a giant. He found it somewhat hard to accept, but upon further thought a sense of sincere relief arose. Recalling everything he had encountered in the past 2 days, he resigned himself to his fate. If he was a giant, so be it, as long as he was alive. According to the Meisters in the castle, rumors said that giants lived in the lands beyond the wall, north of the north. Did he have to live lands beyond the wall in the future? Ned's nearly snapped nerves attributed his transformation into a giant to the infant that had fallen from the sky. Other than that, he could think of no other reason. After becoming a giant, aside from a lack of bodily control like a newborn infant, Ned's 5 senses, such as hearing and vision, were greatly enhanced. The moment he came to his senses, he realized the infant in his arms was gone. After searching around to no avail, he felt unusually certain that the infant was safe. Thus he delayed no longer. There was still a war waiting for him in the north. If he joined the war in this giant form, he could win even if the dragons of House Targaryen came back to life, let alone the fact that dragons had long been extinct on this continent. So he walked slowly toward the north. After gradually gaining control over his massive body, he began to run at a fast pace. The thrill of holding such great power in his hands made him roar loudly from time to time. At this moment, the 20-year-old Ned naturally couldn't notice that his mindset and even his personality had undergone subtle changes in just 2 days. He might still be silent and serious, as was the traditional nature of House Stark, but the speed at which he accepted the facts seemed too fast, as if someone were forcibly squeezing a square stone into an odd shape. Chapter 6. And Chang awakes. The sun tilted westward, with only half of its red orb remaining, announcing the approach of night and drawing away some of the sultry heat. A massive figure casting an extremely long shadow appeared in the afterglow of the setting sun, accompanied by the sound of thumping footsteps. A castle was visible in the distance. Ned calculated in his mind, and found that a journey that would take at least 3 days of non-stop riding had been covered by him in a single afternoon. Along the way, he had encountered scattered pedestrians. Upon seeing the giant from afar, every single one of them had turned and fled in terror. Some were even so frightened that they collapsed on the spot, watching with trembling hearts as the giant thundered closer and then thundered away, leaving a gust of wind in its wake, a scene that would become an unforgettable memory for the rest of their lives. He expected that before long, the giant would be embellished into rumors and local ghost stories, slowly spreading from this place as people came and went. The giant slowly came to a halt, suddenly realizing that in this form approaching the city rashly would surely draw panicked attacks from the city guards. Although he felt a strange confidence in this newly transformed giant body, confident that he would not be harmed by the city guards, he did not want to endure pointless attacks. Furthermore, the Stormlands were Robert's territory. He hadn't come to lay siege but to inquire about the whereabouts of Robert's army so he could regroup with them. After some thought, he considered shouting toward the city from a distance to announce his identity and intentions first. Even if the giant's appearance would inevitably cause a commotion in the city, it would save him from many complications. This was provided that Ned could speak using the giant's body. The awkward part was that currently he could only let out roars. He couldn't even utter a single complete word or syllable as a giant. Beep. Civilization main body crisis has been resolved. Subcolony rig adaptation level is below the command threshold. Retract. Unable to contact the thoughts of the civilization main body. The emergency program has no authority to make decisions while ensuring the safety of the civilization main body. Beep. Mutation detected in the subcolony rig under unknown energy. Executing main program default commands immediately. Disconnecting subcolony rig link. Disconnecting subcolony rig energy supply. Completing independent programming for the subcolony rig. Subcolony rig program stripping complete. Filling with primary induction program. Naming ultra-low-level laborer armor, abbreviated as hyperbitter rig. Execution complete. Beep. Amidst his distress, Ned was astonished to find a faint purple light enveloping him. Looking closely, it was emitted by the dark purple patterns writhing on his body. Simultaneously, a wave of dizziness washed over him, making his legs go soft. In his haste, he supported himself with his right hand and sank into a half-kneeling position. His knee hit the ground with a dull thud. A profound sensation Ned had never experienced before surged into his heart. It felt as if his entire body was soaking in the hot springs of Winterfell. Every muscle fiber seemed to be dissolving and differentiating, and a warm touch spread from his right palm, which was in contact with the ground, to the rest of his body. The dark purple patterns twisted as the giant's body turned fluid, churning and slowly shrinking. First, the dark purple patterns thinned and sank inward, like a fine net of fishing line cutting into the skin. The light also retracted into the giant's body. From a distance, it looked like a giant, hollowed-out human statue kneeling on the ground, emitting a dim purple glow. Then the parts that were not hollowed out seemed to lose their support, suddenly shrinking and collapsing. The massive body shriveled abruptly, kicking up a sudden gale. The dim purple light inside slowly gathered at his right hand before gradually dissipating. As the dust swirled, a dark purple humanoid figure appeared kneeling where the giant had been. The purple wriggled and burrowed deep inside, revealing a pale, long face. Soon Ned's figure emerged with an infant still tied to his chest, A joyful smile broke across Ned's solemn, long face, though the pale smile betrayed an irrepressible weakness. He slowly stood up and stroked the head of the still sleeping infant with his right hand. His gaze swept over his tattered, blood-stained light armor. Through the cracks he could see new skin, and the wound on his right leg had also fully recovered. Then his gray eyes focused on his right hand. He turned it over. Thanks to the setting sun that was still struggling to stay above the horizon, Ned was able to see a pattern formed by intertwining dark purple lines on his palm. The pattern was neat and symmetrical. Bringing his palm closer, he could see extremely fine lines spreading from the center of his palm to his 5 fingers. Ned sensed carefully and found that the pattern on his palm indeed began to glow and flow slowly according to his will, as if it would cover his entire body and turn him into a giant again in the next second. He quickly withdrew the thought and the pattern returned to its original state. The corners of his dry, cracked mouth curled back uncontrollably. He suddenly clenched his right hand tightly, his fist trembling slightly. He gazed deeply at the infant in his arms with a complex look for a moment. He glanced at the castle, which had become a black dot in the distance, gave a helpless sigh, gathered his thoughts, and began to walk. Ned walked until the sky was dotted with stars and the bright moon hung high before arriving at the city gates. After loudly stating his identity and purpose without reservation, the Lord's eldest son, who was left in charge of the city, welcomed Ned inside. The Lord's eldest son carefully noted that although Lord Eddard Stark looked disheveled and his light armor was covered in scars, he was actually unharmed. His gray eyes were so bright that the young man dared not look directly at them. Most peculiar of all was the infant tied to his chest. However, he did not rashly ask any questions, only feeling a secret curiosity. Turning down the Lord's eldest son's offer to hold a feast for him, and after inquiring about the whereabouts of Robert's army, Ned ate a hasty meal in the guest room arranged for him. He then called for a servant to find a wet nurse. Before long, a dark-haired woman of pleasant appearance knocked on the door. After handing the soundly sleeping infant to the wet nurse, Ned stepped out and stood guard at the door, waiting quietly with his exhausted body. While waiting, Ned thought of his sister and the others who had been hastily buried in the ruins of the Tower of Joy. He decided that once everything was settled, he would move his sister's remains to the family crypt, while the bodies of Arthur Howland and the others would be returned to their respective families. As for the infant who died in his sister's arms, it was, as expected, a bastard child born of Rhaegar's coercion. Although the child had died prematurely and should not have had to bear the sins committed by the father's generation, burying it in the family crypt and letting the news spread would not only damage the family's honor but also shame Robert. Given Robert's temperament, if he found out, he would likely disturb the generations of Stark, cause a scene in the Winterfell crypts, and scatter the bastard child's ashes to the wind. At this thought, Ned's mood couldn't help but sour. He rubbed his palm twice with his right thumb. Robert was leading his army in a standoff against Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident River. The fires of war would likely ignite within a few days. The fuse for this war against the Targaryen royalty was his sister Lyanna, who was betrothed to Robert. She had been forcibly taken by Prince Rhaegar. When their father and brother went south to King's Landing to seek justice to no avail, they met a tragic end instead. Strictly speaking, this was a blood feud for House Stark. But Ned, who had grown up with Robert, understood that as things stood, the blood feud for his father, brother, and sister must be avenged and the Targaryen must perish. However, the matter of the bastard child must be kept secret. He let out a long breath. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. The wet nurse stepped out timidly, holding the infant, her face filled with trepidation. Seeing this, Ned hurried forward and asked, "What's wrong?" "My lord, this child has been sleeping the whole time. I tried to feed him, but he didn't respond at all." The young wet nurse mumbled, a hint of a sob in her voice. Ned was stunned. He reached out to take the child and looked him over. Recalling the child's peculiarities, he was puzzled. He thought that no matter what, it was still a child. No matter how different he was from ordinary people, could it be that he didn't even need to drink milk? After pondering for a moment, he remembered how his own injuries had recovered after transforming into a giant, and he seemed to understand. So he comforted the young wet nurse and let her go to rest. He returned to the room with the child, placed him on the bed, tidied himself up, and then fell into a deep sleep. Ned was startled awake by a chill. He flipped over and sat up from the bed, his gaze immediately going to his side. The infant was safe and sound. Looking closely, he could see the child's belly rising and falling slightly with his breath. The chill was coming from the child. He touched the infant's body. The temperature was normal, but when he took his hand away, he felt a wave of coldness. The light around the child seemed to be slightly insufficient, appearing just a fraction darker compared to the bright room. Only then did Ned realize it was broad daylight. The soft morning sunlight streamed through the window, filling the room, and the air seemed to carry a fresh scent. Ned stretched his waist comfortably. In a good mood, he got out of bed, tidied himself up, took the infant, and called for a servant to lead him to the Lord's eldest son. After some pleasantries, Ned changed into a brand new set of light armor that had been gifted to him. He politely declined the Lord's eldest son's invitation to stay, requesting only 2 warhorses and some food and water before riding out of the city toward the Trident River, and Chang felt as if he had returned to Earth. His lovely daughter was waving at him not far away. With excitement he ran toward her, but suddenly a bloody maw appeared out of nowhere and swallowed her. It chewed a few times and then gulped her down. The splashing blood sprayed onto Chang's face, and he was even licked by the thick, saliva-covered tongue extending from the giant mouth. An indescribable feeling gathered in his chest as if it would explode in the next second. Despair had not yet completely enveloped Chang. Before he could even make a move, the tongue swept him up. Forgetting even his useless resistance, he whose heart was as dead as ashes could still feel the stinging pain of the giant mouth's sharp teeth piercing his flesh. The giant mouth chewed slowly, tearing Chang's body apart bit by bit. Is this what Nini felt? To be ridiculously ground into mincemeat bit by bit, slowly losing life amidst pain and despair. The father she saw as everything and who saw her as everything in return. What did I do? I couldn't do anything. As an ordinary person, perhaps the only thing he could do was follow after his daughter, accompanying her to be ground into mincemeat as food, dying within that giant mouth. If I had a chance to do it all over again, I would beat this giant mouth to death, beat all the monsters to death. I want to live well with my daughter. I don't want us to become food for a giant mouth together. If I cannot do it as a human, then I will. His consciousness came to an abrupt halt and darkness enveloped everything, and Chang woke up. Chapter 7, Nuoga. A flood of sounds rushed into his ears. Horses chewing hay, low shouts of unknown meaning, the suppressed yawns of guards, groans coming from more than one place, and most clearly, a strange mechanical voice ringing in his mind. These sounds entered his ears and were easily processed one by his brain, providing Chang with a picture composed of sound, a medieval-style castle. He didn't even need to move his body or use his eyes to observe his surroundings. He vaguely knew he was lying in a dark room. The bed beneath him made a very faint creaking sound, and a few rats were scurrying around. Ignoring the darkness, the mottled ceiling came into view. It seemed he could even see through the roof to the gloomy sky, where a few dim stars were faintly visible, and Chang carefully experienced the various wonderful sensations coming from his body. He keenly realized that the mechanical voice in his mind, though in a strange and obscure language, was now understandable to him. It seemed like a language he was born to know. Beep. Civilization main body's consciousness recovery detected. Initiating link. Encountered unknown interception. Suspected to be an abnormal energy field on the civilization main body. Link failed. Switching to display mode. And Chang felt a slight warmth in his chest, and a purple light screen immediately appeared before his eyes. On the light screen was a giant blue-gray planet, surrounded by some minute mechanical creations. Suddenly the planet seemed to expand, then deflated like a leaking balloon and vanished instantly. Only a dark purple sphere streaked across, piercing through space in a brilliant light and jumping away, inexplicably, and Chang understood that the infant inside that sphere was himself. Escaping from a destroyed planet in a spaceship. Is this planet Krypton? That's freaking ridiculous. At this moment, the mechanical voice rang out, interrupting Chang's internal complaints. This beautiful planet is called Nuoga. It is the mother planet of the civilization main body and the last remaining living planet of the vast Nuoga civilization. Image on the purple light screen changed, gradually zooming out to reveal a galaxy. The Nuoga civilization was once the sole ruler of the Nuoga galaxy, and its territory was constantly expanding outward. Relying on continuously developing armor technology, the Nuoga civilization once almost became the overlord of the entire universe. Mechanical voice paused, and the screen changed again, showing that blue-gray planet once more. The entire territory lost contact in an instant, and the Nuoga mother planet appeared in this strange universe. And Chang listened quietly. The phrase strange universe caused a slight fluctuation in his emotions. Furthermore, it faced the crisis of ultra-high-speed entropy increase. The civilization main body did not have time to take any effective countermeasures before the kindling program automatically activated. Tens of thousands of civilization main body larvae in incubation armor were launched urgently, carrying kindling armor subbodies and a small amount of energy. Tens of thousands? However, the ultra-high-speed entropy increase did not only act on the Nuoga mother planet but everything on it. All tens of thousands of larvae vanished along with the mother planet in the ultra-high-speed entropy increase during the space jump. The Nuoga civilization perished as soon as it appeared in this strange universe, and Chang was somewhat confused. What was beyond the calculations of the kindling program was that one larva miraculously was not affected by the entropy increase. Yes, initially, the kindling program attributed this occurrence to a miracle, and Chang lightly tapped his head. Does not being affected by entropy increase mean he originally belonged to this universe? He just didn't know why he had become a larva of the Nuoga civilization. So did he still have a chance to find Earth in the vast sea of stars and return to his daughter? His excitement had just arisen when it was extinguished by the continuous mechanical voice. That miraculous larva is the current civilization main body. However, during the 3 Nuoga mother planet revolutions, while the kindling program carried the civilization main body through continuous space jumps, the purple light screen shifted, showing the dark purple sphere constantly flashing through the universe. The Kinling program gradually discovered the reason why the civilization main body was able to survive the ultra-high-speed entropy increase. A sleeping infant appeared on the light screen. After excluding the anomaly of premature mature thought waves, the Kinling program found that the nutrient energy absorbed by the civilization main body was too vast. After in-depth testing, it was discovered that the massive energy absorbed by the subject had accumulated within the body. Excluding abnormal thoughts, and Chang remembered that state where everything was clearly under control, yet he was unable to move an inch. It formed an uncalculable and unanalyzable energy flow. This energy flow offset the ultra-high-speed entropy increase, allowing the subject to survive. Hearing this, and Chang began to think rapidly, he pondered. First of all, as a 34-year-old middle-aged man on Earth, he had designed a chirofining verification experiment and recruited a college student named Zhu Zhai as his experimental assistant. That experiment failed because he died and became a Nuoga civilization larva. At the same time, it succeeded. After becoming a Nuoga civilization larva, he had refined his first strand of qi, thus surviving the entropy increase disaster. Afterward, during the continuous space jumps, he had been constantly absorbing energy to refine qi. He once thought he was still in the experiment on Earth. The Kinling program attached to the subject also managed to survive. But because this universe is too strange and the energy absorbed by the subject was too vast, the energy meant to sustain the Kinling armor's continuous random space jumps for 30 Nuoga revolutions was nearly exhausted in just 3. Thus, the civilization main body was forced to make an emergency landing on this planet, inhabited by a low-level civilization. An oval planet appeared in the image. The sphere tore through the atmosphere, igniting in flames as it fell toward the ground. The Kinling program also fell into hibernation due to energy depletion, splitting off this emergency program and its associated emergency armor to ensure the safe growth of the only civilization main body in this universe on this low-level planet. It will wait for the Kinling program to recover and then rebuild the Nuoga civilization. After the emergency landing, the subject was discovered by the low-level natives of this planet. Screen showed Ned raising his sword, about to stab the infant. This low-level native once had thought waves about killing the subject. It is recommended that the subject destroy all low-level organisms on this planet after the Kinling program awakens, and Chang ignored it. After the Kinling program fell into hibernation, the suppression of the subject's thought waves was lifted. Shortly after the subject's consciousness recovered, it went silent for unknown reasons, and Chang remembered his first conscious cultivation. Subsequently, an unknown energy field separated the armor from the subject. Unconscious civilization main body was carried by this low-level native through a series of meaningless primitive battles between low-level natives, and Chang listened, somewhat speechless. Then the mechanical voice stopped, but the images before him continued to change, showing him everything that happened while he was cultivating and unconscious. Looking at the images on the light screen, seeing Ned, who had tied him to his chest, climbing a large tree, being pelted with arrows, yet trying his best to curl his body to protect him, and Chang was a bit moved. Then, seeing Ned transform into a giant, he didn't even know where to begin complaining. As if sensing in Chang's thought waves, the emergency program spoke again. At that time, the subject was in crisis, and the subject's consciousness could not be linked, making it impossible to fuse with the emergency armor. To ensure the safety of the civilization main body, a sub-body was split off to fuse with this low-level native. Afterward, due to the lack of orders from the civilization main body and an unknown mutation in the sub-body, it has been made independent. Since it has no attached program, it is named the Ultra-Low-Level Laborer Armor, abbreviated as Hyperbitter Rig. And Chang didn't want to speak. The images changed. A quite pretty wet nurse Ned on the road, meeting up with Robert, a series of tragic battles. King's Landing with its gates wide open, the Lannisters coming out to welcome them, the city being burned, killed and looted, and the panicked, numb residents. A hasty coronation ceremony, John becoming the hand of the king, Ned returning to the north, a beautiful long-haired lady, the bustling Winterfell, and himself, who never woke up. Scene after scene flashed before Chang's eyes from Ned's perspective, and Chang pondered for a long while. His thoughts fluctuated slightly and he couldn't help but feel puzzled. Connecting everything, it seemed reasonable, but there was one major doubt that he couldn't figure out. Why on earth did I become some Nuoga civilization main body and appear in this strange world? Why me? No one could answer him. After forcing himself to accept all this, another thought popped into Chang's head. Assuming for now that some unknown reason caused me to become like this, then finding out where exactly I am is the key question to determine whether I can still return to Earth with the help of Nuoga civilization's armor technology. And Chang moved his body, carefully sensing the unknown energy field that had transformed from the previously vast sea of qi. He was certain that his extraordinary 5 senses were not brought by the Nuoga armor, but were granted by this thin energy field formed from qi. No, and Chang discovered an anomaly. The causal relationship was reversed. It wasn't that the extraordinary five senses were granted by the energy field, but rather the extraordinary five senses and some other abilities in Chang vaguely perceived composed this energy field, or rather, the chi he refined by absorbing the massive energy of the kindling armor had completely transformed this body after he took control of it, which is why an energy field was generated on the surface of his body. Thinking of this, and Chang tried to cultivate for a bit, and was stunned to find that this chi was no longer stored in the energy center, but existed everywhere throughout his body. Immersing his mind in Chang finally discovered that the chi currently in his body seemed to originate from the deepest part of his body, so deep he couldn't perceive it, and emerged at the very shallow surface of his body. It then returned to the deepest part of his body with traces of energy, back and forth, forming a cycle. This process was extremely fast, yet in Chang's mind could just barely capture it, 3.3 billion cycles per millisecond, which resulted in the thin energy field on the surface of his body. He felt it was somewhat incredible, thinking of Superman, who also possessed an energy field and only existed in comics and movies. Could refining chi eventually turn him into Superman? He had no idea how massive the energy of the emergency program actually was. It was enough energy to annihilate several galaxies if it were to explode. Chapter 8. Stark and Chang felt an itch in his heart like a cat's scratch, eager to verify the changes in himself. But considering his current state as an infant and the unfamiliar environment, he suppressed the urge. Limited by an infant's physiological structure, and Chang could not speak. Even if he could, the only language he knew was his mother tongue from Earth. Although he could strangely understand the Noga language, it did not mean he could speak this unfamiliar tongue. Unable to communicate with this emergency program, he had to keep some questions to himself for now to be addressed later. The purple light screen slowly dissipated, and the room returned to darkness. On Chang's chubby face, his faint eyebrows were furrowed for a long time before finally smoothing out bit by bit in the darkness. The sounds in his ears gradually became more numerous and chaotic. At some point the morning light quietly slipped into the room, bathing everything inside in a layer of hazy light. A soft sound of footsteps approached from afar, accompanied by slightly hurried breathing. With a creak, the door was gently opened, and a figure walked in through the morning light. Jasmine was 19 this year, yet she was already a mother of two. One child had already been weaned, while the other was still in swaddling clothes. 8 months ago, the young lord returned victorious from the war, bringing back an infant he claimed to be his bastard son. Jasmine became the bastard's wet nurse. The bastard was very strange. He had been sleeping for 8 whole months and had never woken up, neither nursing nor excreting. Yet he grew fair and plump. Jasmine was quite frightened at first and reported it truthfully to the lord. However, the lord showed no surprise and merely strictly ordered her not to spread the word, instructing her to care for him diligently every day. Gradually, Jasmine also realized the child's extraordinary nature, but she strictly followed the lord's orders and never breathed a word to anyone. The lord doted on this child. Every day after coming out of the godswood, he would sit by the bed and quietly watch the child for a moment, seemingly hoping the child would wake up the next second. But each time the lord would leave in silent gravity, his face showing no other emotion. Jasmine opened the window and a black crow landed on the sill with a flutter of wings. Its mung bean-sized black eyes stared at the infant on the bed. Instead of its usual long, quiet gaze, it took flight immediately as if startled. Jasmine poked at the hearth fire twice, and when she turned her head she saw a pair of clear, bright eyes watching her quietly, causing her to let out a startled cry. She hurried to the bedside, leaned down, and couldn't help but gently pinch the child's chubby cheek, as if to confirm this wasn't an illusion. Seeing the child turn his head away in disdain, Jasmine was inexplicably overjoyed and a bit flustered at the same time. God's bless, this child is finally awake. And Chang could hear the woman's suddenly quickened heartbeat and see every fine pore on her vibrant face. If he focused his mind slightly, he could even see through the skin to a thin layer of fat and a small amount of red muscle. This made him uncomfortably turn his gaze away. The surprised words ringing in his ears reminded him of an obscure language he had occasionally encountered on Earth that had almost gone extinct. It was a language spelled solely with letters, with strange pronunciations and an inverted, chaotic way of expression. The words the woman spoke were very close in pronunciation to that obscure language, but there were subtle yet distinct differences. Moreover, the woman's appearance seemed extremely foreign to Chang. It was a look distinctly different from the humans on Earth. Thinking back, such an appearance seemed to have only appeared in historical documents. That book seemed to describe several races that had once existed in history, one of which resembled the woman's appearance. High forehead, slightly deep eye sockets, blue eyes, a straight bridge of the nose, a slightly high jaw, and a relatively large mouth. It had a peculiar three-dimensional quality. The woman gently picked him up and walked quickly out of the room, then hesitated and came back to place him on the bed. Then she walked out of the room with a beaming smile and closed the door. And Chang, listening to the voices coming from the entire castle, rapidly analyzed the meaning of this unfamiliar language. Thanks to his powerful thinking capacity at this moment, before the door opened again, he cross-referenced this unfamiliar language with his familiar mother tongue and was barely able to understand a bit of it. A moment later, the door opened again. A man wearing a brown fur coat walked in, with Jasmine following closely behind. As Ned entered the room, his eyes met the infant's. Inexplicably, Ned felt that the meaning contained in this gaze was not something an infant should have, but rather like the wise and gentle gaze of Master Lewin, the castle's Meister. Ned couldn't help but pause, and Jasmine almost bumped into his back from behind. Collecting his thoughts, Ned didn't stop his pace. He walked to the bedside and looked down at the infant on the bed. Ned's gaze was extremely complex, a look of joy mixed with fear. It was certainly not the look of a father watching his own child. "You may leave us, Jasmine," Ned said. The morning light passed through the open window, reflecting on Ned's serious long face. Facing the window, the morning light played across Ned, creating a strong contrast of light that prevented Jasmine from seeing his slightly hazy expression. But it did not stop her from hearing him and exiting the room, gently closing the door behind her. Ned sat on the stool placed by the bed, maintaining the same posture he had for the past 8 months. Only this time, the infant who used to sleep soundly on the bed was awake and calmly meeting his gaze. N's lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something, but he swallowed the words back down. "He is still a child who cannot speak," Ned silently reminded himself, yet the various incredible aspects of the infant before him made him subconsciously stop viewing N Chang as just a child. He simply raised his right hand and displayed his palm before the infant, an inquiring look in his eyes. Chang did not pretend to act like an infant should, even though he knew how an infant would behave from his cherished memories of raising his daughter. Although in fact he was currently an infant, through the images on that purple light screen, he clearly understood what had happened to this long-faced young man and knew the meaning of his current actions. So he reached out and touched the dark purple necklace resting against his chest, his gaze meeting Ned's with affirmation. End, who had already guessed as much, let out a long breath upon receiving this confirmation. Ned spoke hesitantly, "I'm not sure if you can understand me." And Chang signaled for him to continue, his chubby face showing a serious expression unbefitting his age. Seeing this, an unmasked smile flashed in Ned's gray eyes. Realizing this might be inappropriate, he quickly turned around, picked up the iron rod used to adjust the charcoal, and poked at the hearth fire that was about to go out. He continued, "I know your origins must be beyond my imagination. In the long history recorded, even tracing back to the legends handed down from the ancient era of the first men, no case similar to yours can be found." And Chang was a bit dazed. The language he had just roughly parsed was not enough to support his understanding of Ned's long string of words, but he didn't show it, simply using his powerful memory to record every pronunciation of the sentence. As Ned spoke, he couldn't help but gently rub his palm with his right thumb, a habit he had inadvertently developed. In the 8 months since the war ended, Ned had been consulting Master Lewin every day, rifling through ancient books in Master Lewin's study. Not finding what he wanted, Ned had even sent Lewin back to the Citadel specifically to search for possible clues buried in the written records. In this process, although Ned failed to find an answer that could explain his experience, he greatly enriched his knowledge, becoming almost fully acquainted with the folklore, rumors, and myths from across the continent. During this time, after Lewin returned from the Citadel, he vividly told him a rumor that had recently spread from the Stormlands to the Citadel about a giant over 10 meters tall appearing near the King's Road, running toward the north. Lewin then explained that while giants did indeed exist in the lands beyond the wall, they were only 4 or 5 meters tall at most, moved slowly, could not run at all, and it was impossible for them to appear in the southern Stormlands. Although Lewin's expression had the usual subtlety of a Meister, his faint mockery and disdain for the rumor of the giant in the Stormlands were unmistakable, leaving Ned not knowing whether to laugh or cry, and the memory stuck with him. "Your appearance," Ned showed a look of recollection as if the collapsed Tower of Joy appeared before him and the faces of Lyanna and the others flashed by one by one. He did not continue, his mood turning slightly low. Looking at the hearth fire, which held only a few sparks, he set the iron rod aside and stood up. He looked out the window, where the massive heart tree that had grown there for an unknown amount of time came into view, its scattered, bright red leaves catching his eye. "Perhaps it has a meaning unknown to mortals." A slight worry appeared on Ned's serious long face. The people of the North have the blood of the first men flowing in their veins. Unlike the Southerners who believe in the seven who have names, faces, and bodies, they devoutly believe in the ancient gods who have neither names nor faces, gods belonging to the verdant forests, shared by the first men and the vanished children of the forest. As the Warden of the North and Lord of Winterfell, Ned held the faith of the Northmen. However, the events he had personally experienced lately, while not changing his devotion, seemed to have loosened some of the things he insisted upon. Specifically, a few months ago, when he carried the infant into the godswood intending to name him under the witness of the heart tree, the bright red leaves of the heart tree rustled and fell, blocking his path. That scene was deeply etched into Ned's mind, and the naming ceremony ended without a result. Then Ned turned around, a meaningful smile appearing on his serious long face. "But regardless, first you will be a child of Stark." Without waiting for the infant's reaction, Ned slowly walked out of the room. He intended to go see the sept built solely for the lady. Perhaps the seven, whom the Southerners believed in and who had names and faces, could witness this child's naming ceremony. Chapter 9. The wheels turned slowly. One and Chang watched the long-faced youth depart. His senses, eyes, ears, and nose were somewhat out of control. Precisely, he could not decide what he saw, heard, smelled, or perceived. This was originally quite normal. Almost no life form can fully control its senses to decide what to look at or what not to hear. Because the feedback from all things in the world is one way, limited by physiological structures, environmental changes, and other factors, a being's perception of the world is passive and cannot be subjectively controlled. Furthermore, it often results in partial or even false feedback, and Chang was no exception. He passively perceived this strange world, though the feedback he received, whether true or not, was at least comprehensive. Just how comprehensive was it? Take the two people who just appeared in his sight as an example. An ordinary person would mostly see their appearance, physique, and clothing, while someone more observant might notice some hidden details on that basis. And Chang was different. He could see everything an ordinary person saw: their appearance, physique, clothing, and hidden details. But beyond that, he could see through the surface of the skin to the fat, tendons, muscles, internal organs, and bones. Most importantly, these were fed back into his mind simultaneously. It wasn't just a single layer, but a holistic perspective that was difficult to describe. It was as if by decomposing the human body layer by layer, he could see every layer and the whole composed of those layers at the same time. What he couldn't control was this: the layer that remained in his perspective for the longest time wasn't necessarily the whole composed of every layer, but rather a random layer. Perhaps 1 millisecond, Ned in his eyes looked no different from what an ordinary person saw, but the next millisecond he became a monster wrapped in red muscle like a flayed creature, or perhaps a moving skeleton and other such sights. The same was true for what he heard. Within a sphere centered on him that happened to encompass all of Winterfell, every sound within that space rang in his ears and was fed back to his brain. Note, every sound. That is, every vibration regardless of frequency or duration. He could not control which sound rang in his ears for the longest. It might not be the sound he was accustomed to as an ordinary person. Perhaps 1 millisecond it was various unknown and temporarily incomprehensible sounds, and the next millisecond it became the various sounds he was familiar with. Thanks to his equally powerful brain and intellect, he was able to exert effort to search for and distinguish the things he recognized and understood. His other senses were the same. What he considered a loss of control was merely his temporary inability to reverse his sensory habits as an ordinary person. After all, that narrow, limited, and even false perception had accompanied in Chang for decades. For an ordinary person without such perception, it is truly difficult to imagine what the world looks like under such senses, let alone accurately describe it in words. Even when Ned was merged with the Noga armor within him, his perception was merely based on that of an ordinary person, magnified several or even a dozen times. It was still fundamentally an ordinary person's perception. So he never would have guessed that while In Chang seemed to be meeting his gaze and listening quietly, what In Chang saw was not what Ned assumed, but rather another bizarre and phantasmagoric scene. In that perspective, In Chang found familiar fragments amidst the massive amount of information to piece together the world he knew as an ordinary person. While striving to restore a normal person's perception, he was also desperately and rapidly analyzing every aspect of this strange world. Ned walked out of the room, gave a few instructions to Molly, and headed toward the sept. Along the way, he encountered residents and guards saluting him. He merely gave brief responses, not stopping to chat for a few words as he usually would. Passing through the damp paths that still seemed dark under the morning light, the sept, a rare sight in the north, came into view. As Ned approached, he found the middle-aged nun up early and offering prayers in the morning light. When this nun was young, she had served the seven in the solemn sept of Riverrun of House Tully, while also being tasked with teaching the two Tully daughters. Ned had married Catelyn in Riverrun, and after the war ended, the nun had followed the returning Ned and his wife to Winterfell. He did not disturb her, standing silently to the side, waiting for the nun to finish her prayers. His thoughts drifted, and Ned remembered that wedding in Riverrun. Deep down, he had always felt some dissatisfaction. But at the time, to ally with Riverlands and avenge his father and brother, he had to complete this wedding that should have been his brother Brandon's. Therefore, he hid his dissatisfaction well, and no one could see a trace of it on his silent, solemn, long face. Catelyn was beautiful. This woman raised in the South had passionate auburn hair and a pair of clear, charming blue eyes. Ned admitted he could not feel any ill will toward this beautiful woman, but there was always a knot in his heart. Because Catelyn loved his brother Brandon, and it was Brandon to whom she had been betrothed. He was merely a replacement in this political marriage after his brother's death. Catelyn didn't love him at all, especially after the war ended. Catelyn was already pregnant and near term. He had been unusually happy for a while then. Thinking back carefully later, he had only shared a bed with her once after the wedding before leaving for the Tower of Joy to rescue his sister Lyanna, followed by nearly a year of war. Furthermore, Catelyn herself was the subject of some unpleasant rumors. This forced him to harbor some terrible thoughts in his heart. Particularly after gaining the ability to transform into a giant, his mindset had undergone some subtle changes. So he had brought the constantly slumbering infant to Catelyn to see and told her the infant was his bastard. Thereafter, a rift formed between the two of them. To Ned, this rift was foul and hard, difficult to dissolve, and he was often cold toward Catelyn. But to Catelyn, this rift was merely the bastard Ned had brought back. Ned's usual coldness toward her was also interpreted as the habitual temperament of a Northman. Despite her extreme dislike for the bastard Ned brought back, it did not stop her from doing her best to fulfill her duties and responsibilities as a wife. "My lord," Sister Morden, having finished her prayers, interrupted Ned's drifting thoughts and pulled him back to reality. "Sister Morden," Ned responded, then stated his purpose. "Sister Morden should know that I have a bastard." Sister Morden nodded, her face showing no expression. "Child was with me during the war and until now." Ned thought for a moment and decided to treat the day the child fell from the sky as the child's birthday. "He is already 1 year and 6 months old. He has not yet been named, and I wish to name him under the witness of the seven." As the morning light scattered, Sister Morden, whose face already bore light wrinkles, showed a look of surprise. "Does my lord intend to convert to the new gods?" Ned shook his head gently. He was a Northman with the blood of the first men flowing in his veins, and his ancestors had worshipped the old gods for generations. "Then my lord should go to the godswood and have it witnessed under the heart tree," Sister Morden offered as a pertinent suggestion. Ned smiled bitterly in his heart. The red leaf that had blocked his path was the response of the old god's rejection. "Child carries my lord's bloodline," she added, and solemn long face became even more solemn and silent. For a moment he did not know how to respond. "He is not exactly a Northman," Ned added internally, "nor is he a Southerner or even a person of this world. Perhaps I can have Catelyn perform the rite for him." "Absolutely not." Sister Morden quickly objected, her voice rising slightly. Then, before Ned could show any anger, she continued, "Catelyn is a devout believer of the seven. She would never perform a rite for a bastard that is not her own child. Even if Catelyn were willing, a bastard does not have the right to be anointed with holy oils. That would be a sign of disrespect to the seven." Ned was stunned. Had both the new gods and the old gods refused to witness for this child, his heart churned and he couldn't help but rub the palm of his right hand twice before turning to leave in a foul mood. Once Ned was far away, Sister Morden made a gesture of reverence to the seven. A black crow perched on a tree branch silently witnessed all of this, ruffled its wings, and let out a harsh, grating cry. By the time Ned came to his senses, he had unknowingly arrived at the godswood. The branches and leaves intertwined overhead to form a canopy, and the fragmented morning light struggled to squeeze through the narrow gaps to dispel the gloom. Ned approached the heart tree and sat by a pool of cold spring water beneath it, gazing at the deep, melancholy face carved into the trunk of the heart tree, hoping to find a trace of solace there. A long, long time passed. Ned let out a long sigh, one filled with relief and a sense of liberation. He stood up and began to walk, his thick-soled shoes with meticulous stitching crushing the hand-shaped red leaves that covered the ground, making a low, rustling sound. The child had fallen from the sky and possessed many divine qualities. His origins were impossible to understand, and both the old gods and the new gods had subtly refused to witness his naming ceremony. N's thoughts turned as he walked without stopping, and a trace of irrepressible excitement suddenly appeared on his long face. What did it mean that the new gods and the old gods refused to witness this child's naming ceremony? Ned rubbed the palm of his right hand twice, forcibly suppressing the startling guess that had appeared in his mind and cutting off the train of thought that was tending toward danger. He walked toward the solar, intending to consult with Master Luwin. Even without the witness of any deity, this child's name would still appear in the world today, he thought secretly. Just as he stepped out of the shadows of the canopy, he was met by a red-haired woman carrying an infant in her arms. He came face to face with her. The woman was Catelyn, and her blue eyes came to rest on Ned. No matter how many dark and terrible guesses Ned had deep in his heart, the beautiful woman before him was his lawful wife. He quickened his pace to reach Catelyn's side. He saw no expression on the woman's face, but the infant in her arms smiled and reached out toward him while babbling. His slightly furrowed brow smoothed out and Ned revealed a heartfelt smile. Chapter 10. The wheels turned slowly too. "Isn't the child lovely?" Catelyn's gaze shifted from Ned to the infant in her arms. Ned lowered his head and reached out his right hand to tease the infant, letting out a chuckle. The response sounded like a muddled, perfunctory sound squeezed reluctantly from his throat. "No wonder you spend so much time there every day." Ned glanced at Catelyn sideways, understanding she was referring to the other child, the bastard he had led her to believe was his. He didn't take the dissatisfaction in her words to heart, nor did he respond. A silence fell between the two. Catelyn felt a pang of bitterness, thinking of the various rumors about the bastard among the castle servants that had suddenly vanished a few months ago. She finally understood the weight that bastard held in Ned's heart. Having grown up in a noble family, Catelyn didn't actually care if her husband had bastards or how many there were. What she cared about and resented was the bastard being brought home. By the mercy of the seven, when Ned brought the bastard before her, she was still pregnant with their soon-to-be-born child. Though he was a Stark, he wasn't Brandon after all, and he lacked Brandon's consideration and tenderness. As soon as this thought surfaced, Catelyn quickly suppressed it, silently praying to the seven for atonement. Then her expression changed slightly, becoming somewhat unnatural. She gently brushed aside Ned's hand that was teasing the child and said in her usual tone, "I'm taking the child to the Godswood. The pond under the heart tree is a good place to go." Ned looked up, their eyes met for a brief moment, and then they both looked away. Ned was always like this, while Catelyn felt a bit guilty because of the thought that had just surfaced. In truth, she didn't like the Godswood in Winterfell. It wasn't full of sunlight, flowing streams, and singing birds like the one in Riverrun. Instead, it was filled with darkness and a heavy, profound atmosphere. As they passed each other, the infant in Catelyn's arms struggled to turn around, his large blue eyes staring at Ned's receding back. The morning light had faded and the hazy sun of the north quietly climbed a bit higher. The canopy formed by the thick, intertwined branches and leaves seemed to turn into a fishing net with fine holes, casting dappled light onto Catelyn. "Ned." Suddenly she turned and called out. Ned turned back at her call. Catelyn stood at the junction of dappled light and shadow, her long red hair seemingly ablaze. Like an elf wandering among flowers, she leaped vibrantly into his vision. He was stunned for a moment. Before he could ask anything, he saw the red-haired elf give a slight smile and turn to walk briskly into the woods with the child in her arms. Ned stood there dazed for a moment, and when he came to his senses, his mood suddenly became a bit more cheerful. At the sound of the door opening and closing, Maester Luwin, who was feeding the ravens, turned to look and saw the young lord push open the door and enter the bright room. "My lord." He put down the birdseed in his hand and bowed. "Master Luwin," Ned returned the greeting, his pace unstopping. "I've come to discuss something with you." Walking up to Maester Louis,